Glasses on. This is an interesting topic that I was excited to do, and there has not been a whole lot written on Wright and Rice Foundry. Usually it gets 2 or 3 sentences in a larger book. Richard Sheridan wrote an article, which I'll get to in a minute, and he had maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs or more about the Foundry, but there has not been a lot written about it, and the more I found out about it, the more I wanted to know. I've been researching it off and on for about 15 years, and it intrigues me the more that I get into it. According to the late Richard Sheridan, in his 1999 Journal of Muscle Shoals History article, Civil War Manufacturing in the Tennessee Valley, industrial development first began in the Tennessee Valley in 1818 with the establishing of the first blast furnace on Cedar Creek near Russellville in Franklin County. So you can see the little inset map. Cedar Creek may not show up really great on there, but I labeled it. So that kind of surprised me that there was a blast furnace on Cedar Creek in 1818 near Russellville. I mean, that's about as early as you can get. That's before Franklin became a county. This Florence Herald article of August 11th, 1892 is kind of a reminiscence. James Wright, who was one of the partners in the Wright and Rice Foundry and Machine Shop near Florence, had been in town recently, and he was interviewed by the editors of the Florence Herald, William Bunting and his brother. And this article is interesting because, for one thing, it says that the old foundry was founded in 1846 by James Wright and William Rice, 3 miles from Florence, or this city, 3 miles from Florence. But in the body of the article it says, quote, Mr. Wright came here from Erie, Pennsylvania, though of Irish birth, coming to America when a mere lad. At the breaking out of the war, a contract was entered into with the Confederacy for lathes, planes, and drills for making ordnances, also shot, shell, and canister up to 10 inches in diameter. One contract called for 300 tons shot and canister, which was not completed on account of General Wilson's raid through the section. The crude iron was obtained at the Van Leer and Kirkman furnaces on the Tennessee River near Clifton. The pig iron was for a time carted through the city while under federal rule, strange to say, without being disturbed. And the Herald seems to have gotten some of its peripheral details wrong, which I hope to sort out as we go along. But what it says about General Wilson's raid, hang on to that, and we'll get to that near the end. There were several other foundries and machine shops, not only in Alabama, but in the Tennessee Valley. Tuscumbia had one, which I've got 2 different newspaper advertisements from the North Alabamian from 1836 and 1845, and I'm not sure how long either of these were in operation. Laney might know if either of these were in operation when the war broke out. I don't think they were. And then Huntsville had an iron foundry at least as early as 1834, if not earlier than that. Then there was an iron and brass foundry and machine shop down in Montgomery. And I found this interesting, that after the war, by 1875, the Mountain Mills community near Barton in Colbert County, Alabama, had its own foundry and machine shop. And by mid-March of 1875, an effort was begun to relocate it to Tuscumbia. And I haven't been able to figure out yet if it was ever relocated. Laney may be able to answer that question. Well, regarding the Wright and Rice Foundry, Jill K. Garrett, one of Lauderdale County's first historians and one of our first authors, wrote in her History of Lauderdale County, Alabama, quote, Wright and Rice in 1831, owned by Mrs. Johnson, had an extensive foundry and machine shop run by water power on Cox Creek, unquote. Then Bill McDonald, Florence's first city historian who passed away several years ago, in his Walk Through the Past, wrote in his 1997 book, A Walk Through the Past, People and Places of Florence and Lauderdale County, Alabama, that the Wright and Rice Foundry was, quote, erected in 1835 by William Johnson. And then the late Richard Sheridan, the Sheffield city historian, and a member of our Civil War Roundtable, as well as the publications chairman for the Tennessee Valley Historical Society's Journal, which we have over there, wrote an article on Civil War manufacturing in the Tennessee Valley, in which he said that he also said the foundry was erected in 1835 by William Johnson. So we've already got 3 dates, 1831, 1835, and 1846. So not unusual with local history that is not as well documented as we all wish it was. And when these guys wrote, they didn't have easy access to a lot of the internet stuff that we have. But regardless, it seems, though, William Johnson, W.P. Johnson, bought the property on which he built the foundry from resident Freeman Gresham, who would be T.B. Larimore of Mars Hill's father-in-law, in August of 1838, as attested by this deed. So he bought the property in August of 1838, and at some point shortly thereafter, apparently erected the foundry. Now, I don't know how long W.P. Johnson and his wife operated the foundry. It couldn't have been a very long time, because in August of 1838, brothers James A. and Reverend Felix Johnson had bought it. Reverend Johnson served as president of LaGrange Military Academy near Leeton in Franklin County from 1855 until 1858, and their firm was known as Johnson Foundry, or Johnson and Brothers Foundry. Reverend Felix Johnson was born in 1813, one of 5 children born to pioneer parents in Wilson County, Tennessee. His older brother James would serve as his business partner later in life. Johnson was educated at Cumberland College in Princeton, Kentucky, where he took academic classes half of the day while working in a machine shop the other half of the day. In 1837, he married Mary Lucinda McCord, and the couple had 7 children. Lucinda died in around 1867, and Felix took another wife, Rosa Coulter Calvert. Serving pastorates in Middle Tennessee and Northwest Alabama for several years, in 1855, Reverend Felix Johnson accepted the call of LaGrange near Leeton in Franklin to serve as president, which post he held until 1858, and in 1858 as chaplain and professor of mental and moral sciences. By 1860, Johnson had relocated to Carroll County, Tennessee. By 1880, he was living in Paris in Lamar County, Texas, and he died in Cleburne, Texas, at the home of one of his daughters on December 9th, 1883. So far, and I can't give you the extensive biography of his brother that I can for Felix, but we'll get to him a little bit in a moment. But so far, I've only been able to find 2 published references to Johnson Foundry, or Johnson Brothers Foundry, in Lauderdale County, from the Huntsville, Alabama Democrat of August 7th, 1844, and the Jackson, Mississippi Southern Reformer of August 17th, 1844, reprinting information from the Franklin County, Alabama Democrat, which described, quote, a Democratic barbecue, unquote, held at the foundry, attended by approximately 2,000 people, including 200 or 300 ladies. And the paper felt compelled to point out there were 200 or 300 ladies at this thing. Now, James A. Johnson, Felix Johnson's brother, was born in 1804. He married his first wife, Elizabeth Ellett, in Madison County, Alabama, in 1831. By 1860, the Johnsons had moved to Hardin County, Tennessee. Interestingly, James and Elizabeth Ellett's daughter, Frances Keturah Kitty Johnson, married Colonel Noel Franklin Cherry, who became the head of the Cherry Cotton Mills, which relocated to Florence from Barton in Colbert County in 1890. And for much of the 1850s to 1890s period, the Cherries lived in southern Middle Tennessee. James A. Johnson married his second wife, Narcissa Locke Irwin Black, in April of 1878 in McNairy County, Tennessee. Narcissa died in 1894, and I don't have a death date for James. I couldn't find one, but he apparently died between 1880 and 1894, as she's listed as a widow at the time of her death, and he's not listed in her estate inventory or any of that kind of stuff. By 1850, Felix Johnson, his brother, had moved to Hardin County, Tennessee, and then later he would be in Carroll County, Tennessee by 1860. At some point, Felix's brother James had gone into partnership with James Wright in the firm of Johnson and Wright at the old Johnson Brothers Foundry. James Wright was born about 1818 in Ireland. His 1850 census enumeration listed him along with several other foundry employees in the household of James A. Johnson. And if I can get the pointer to work, if I can figure out where it is, this is James Wright in the household of James A. Johnson, who's listed as a machinist, and James Wright, ditto, meaning also a machinist. They were working at the foundry. The other men were listed as having the same occupation. It's interesting the way they've spelled machinist phonetically, but they're hooked on phonics. And there was a James Wright listed in an 1848 jurors list in Lauderdale County as a cabinet maker living near Cox's Creek, which I think may be the same James Wright. At any rate, by 1860, James Wright was superintendent of the Wright and Rice family, married with 2 children. And this is his obituary. James Wright died July 9, 1899 at his home in Jackson, Tennessee, where he owned a cottonseed oil mill. His Florence Herald obituary gave a summary of his partnership in the Wright and Rice firm. Now, as for Johnson and Wright, before they became Wright and Rice, Johnson and Wright's 1850 industrial census enumeration recorded them as a machinery and casting operation with $3,000 of capital in the machine shop and $2,500 of capital in the casting department. The machine shop was powered by water. 12 men were employed in the machine shop and were paid an average of $20 a month. 4 men worked in the casting department at an average of $20 per month. And of course, as this was 19th century America, mid-19th century America, women did not do these types of jobs. So all the employees that I've been able to uncover were men. Now, their 1850 slave censuses enumerations recorded James Wright as having 1 enslaved man aged 30. 10 years back in 1840, Felix Johnson had had 2 slaves, one a man between the ages of 24 and 35. By 1860, William Wright had 7 slaves, 3 of whom could have been old enough to have eventually worked at the foundry. So some or all of these African American slaves, of course unnamed, may have worked in and around the foundry. Now on May 5th, 1853, the Reverend Felix Johnson and his wife Lucinda, by that time living in Hardin County, Tennessee, sold the foundry to James Wright and William Rice, quote, partners under the firm name of Wright and Rice, for the sum of $6,000, and the property consisted of 299 and 92/100 acres. And there's the deed for that property transaction. And this is a map from Greg Boyd's Family Maps of Lauderdale County showing you where that 299 and 92/100 acres actually was. This is Mars Hill. This is Petersville, Forest Hills, Greenview Cemetery, Sherwood Forest. You guys all know where this is in Lauderdale. The Cedars. There still is a Gresham Cemetery behind the school. And here's Delos Bacon's 1907 map of Florence showing the location of the Wright and Rice Foundry and Machine Shop, roughly 4 miles north and east of Florence. Now, William T. Rice, the other partner in Wright and Rice, was born in 1824 in Alabama and died June 20th, 1874 in Iuka, Tishomingo County, Mississippi. Haven't found his obituary yet. But he was married to Sarah Walton Williams, and the couple had several children. Rice and family had relocated to Iuka by 1870, where Rice's occupation was listed in that year's census as mill proprietor. Well, eventually, Elder T.B. Larimore of Mars Hill Academy eventually bought the foundry, which at that time consisted of approximately 452 acres. And you can see it outlined in red. So from 299 and 92/100, they went up to 452 at some point. So it was a pretty massive concern. And here we have an artist's drawing of what Mars Hill and especially the Foundry buildings looked like in 1876 at the time T.B. Larimore bought the property. It's obviously not to scale. It's an artist's conceptual drawing. I don't even think they have drawn Cox Creek on here. Maybe that's it. I can't tell. But this is an artist's rendering of what the Mars Hill and the Foundry looked like. So this is the Larimore house that burned right before COVID. So this would be where the school is now. And this would be right about where Gresham Hill's assisted living place is. By the time it went out of business in 1869, the Wright and Rice Foundry consisted of, quote, a foundry and machine shop with about 490 acres of land attached, on which is a good water power, a machine shop 120 feet long by 40 feet wide, 2.5 stories high, a 12-foot high overshot water wheel, which is where they got their power, also a foundry building containing 2 cupolas, a fan, steam saw and grist mill, 8-inch cylinder engine, 24 feet boiler, 40 feet in diameter, sawmill with 24 feet carriage and 50-inch saw, 12 good dwelling houses, 3 good farms, 94.5 acres of good farming land called the Dutch Place, situated 4 miles from Florence on the military road, 160 acres of good farming land, well timbered, situated on the Waynesboro Road, 4 miles north of Florence, called the Kentucky Place, and 100 acres of land containing a good mill site and water power on Second Creek called the Bray Place, unquote. So they had a massive amount of property for 1869. Now this is a photo of the old barn that used to be at Mars Hill. On Wednesday, December 11th, 1957, the Florence Herald ran a story on Mars Hill Bible School, which had opened on the site of the old Mars Hill Academy in 1947. In the article, staff writer Lorene Frederick stated that, quote, in 1892, T.B. Larimore bought the old foundry and moved it to the location where Mars Hill Bible School cafeteria now stands. It was made into a barn and used as such until 1947, when the Bible school converted it into an auditorium and lunchroom, unquote. So I know the 1892 purchase date for the foundry by Larimore is not correct, but could this be the old foundry building converted into a barn? Would they have been able to move a building that big from its place where the Mars Hill Church of Christ is now up to where the school is? I'm not sure, and that was one reason I wanted Greg to be here, and because I wanted to pick his brain about Wilson too. But so it's possible that it was moved and converted into a barn. Otherwise, I can't tell you when the foundry buildings were torn down. Well, I know that the purchase date of 1892 is not right, so that may just be folklore, but I'd like to investigate that further to see if we could figure that out a little bit more precisely. Well, by 1860, the Wright and Rice Foundry and Machine Shop had a capital stock of $20,000 and was producing an average of 5 engines per year valued at $13,000. They were making 11 circular saws a year valued at $3,000, producing 12 horsepower a year valued at $1,800, as well as producing $8,000 worth of castings and forge works annually. By 1860, 30 hands were employed, each making an average of $23 a month, which was probably pretty good money in 1860. Yeah, so that was pretty good money for that time. Now, May 19, 1855, Florence Gazette ad notified the public that the firm was set up to make, quote, steam engines and circular sawmills, all sizes of iron for sash sawmills and grist mills, cotton gins and gin gearing, cotton and wool cards, wood and iron turning lathes of all sizes, shafting and pulleys, cotton whippers, wheat thrashers, straw cutters, corn shellers, coach axles and boxes for 2, 4, and 6 horses, wagon boxes, printers, roller molds, and all kinds of castings made to order at the shortest notice, unquote. And I've rearranged the picture because the ad drew special attention to the fact that it had, quote, bought the right of Levitt's celebrated corn and cob crushers for the counties of Lauderdale, Limestone, Franklin, Morgan, and Madison. So that is apparently what Levitt's corn cob corn and cob crusher looked like. Patton and Bean of the firm Robert Miller Patton and J.N. Bean were, quote, the general agents, unquote, for Wright and Rice. Patton and Bean dissolved their partnership in October 1858, selling out to Patton, Weems and Company, a new firm consisting of partners J. Brand Patton, James M. Weems, and William A. Patton, who presumably continued as agents for the Foundry, though I'm not sure. Oh, I'm sorry. I reversed those. J.F. Phelps was the firm's carriage and wagon builder. It mentioned in that earlier ad that they built all kinds of wagons, so J.F. Phelps advertised himself as the firm's carriage and wagon builder in a separate advertisement from November 9th, 1859. So here's the Patton and Bean advertisement for their dissolution. They were the agents for the Foundry, and I think Patton and Weems probably took over after Patton and Bean dissolved.
So they would have been in competition with Florence Wagon Works?
Well, Florence Wagon Works wasn't founded until 1889. Yeah, so it was a lot later. There were some carriage and buggy manufactories in Florence, in downtown Florence. Several of them that got burned out by the Union Army when Corning came through, but the Florence Wagon Works didn't exist yet. So I've tried to identify as many known employees of the various incarnations of the Foundry as I can, and I've got about 30 possibilities. Now you'll notice this T.B. Gaskin, who was a molder. I think this may be the same guy as this Thomas B. Gookin below. They're just getting the name messed up, but I'm not sure. So these are the guys that and a lot of these men in their 1850 and 60 census enumerations, it lists molder Foundry, superintendent Foundry, carpenter Foundry or whatever. So there's the first 17, and here's the last few. So if anybody recognizes any of the names and can tell me a little bit more about them, that would be great. So again, we know there were 16 in 1850 and 30 by 1860, and from the census enumerations, most of these guys lived right around the Foundry, and I think they might have actually had a kind of little enclosed village right there, so they didn't have to come from very far. One of the employees was Irish immigrant machinist at Wright and Rice, later lawyer, and in the 1870s Lauderdale County Circuit Court clerk John Andrew Thompson. John Andrew Thompson was born in Dalepatrick, County Down, Ireland, March 9th, 1831. Around 1845 or 6, John and two of his sisters, Mary Cairns and Sarah Thompson, came to America, according to family tradition, stowing away on a ship bound for New Orleans. John A. Thompson married Mary Jane Gresham, Esther Laramore's sister, so Thompson was T.B. Laramore's brother-in-law. He married her on September 4th, 1852. He and Mary Jane had 9 children, 5 daughters, and 4 sons, several of whom attended their Uncle Laramore's Mars Hill Academy. In 1866, John A. Thompson was appointed Circuit Court Clerk of Lauderdale County, Alabama, being reappointed by General Pope in 1867 during Reconstruction, which post he held until his death in 1873. Sometime previous to this, Thompson had been admitted to the bar of Lauderdale County, and again prior to 1866, or at least the early 1860s, he had worked as a machinist at Wright and Rice. And he's buried in the Gresham Cemetery near Mars Hill. And of course, he was a member of Florence Lodge number 14, Free and Accepted Masons. Yeah, he was a Freemason. So he's one of the Foundry guys that I know the most about.
You say that's in the Gresham Cemetery?
The Gresham Cemetery behind Mars Hill. Now, on Thursday night, December 12th, 1861, George W. Watkins of the Foundry and Mary Ann Berry were married at the home of her brother, Benson L. Jenkins, but I can't tell you much more about them yet, other than that they got married at her brother's house.
And the food was not expensive. It was good.
If you grow it yourself.
Yeah, pretty good.
Well, on January 17th, 1912, Thomas B. Gookin, and we saw him in that list of employees earlier, passed away in Corinth, Mississippi at 73 years of age. His obituary noted that he'd been employed at Wright and Rice, but had also been a student at Florence Wesleyan, now UNA, and also served in the Confederate Army. But I looked for his Confederate service records and I cannot find them. So if he served in the Confederate military out of Lauderdale County, he has no records. They're not on the microfilm, they're not on Fold 3, they're not in the index of consolidated index of Confederate soldiers. So that may be anecdote, because I know for a fact that he worked at the Foundry in 1860 because he's listed in the census as, I think, a molder at the Foundry. But anyway, he died in 1912 in Corinth, Mississippi. And Wright and Rice, I said it was kind of like a self-contained village, which I think it probably was. I know they had at least 12 employee houses, probably somewhere near the Foundry. They also had their own company cemetery, as it were, which is in front of the First Assembly of God, 3610 Helton Drive, Florence, Alabama. I was hoping Janice Curott and Dr. Curott might be here because she's a member of that church, and probably they go past this every time they go to services.
I learned something new. I didn't know that cemetery was over there.
If you didn't know it was there, you couldn't see it. This is an aerial shot showing where the cemetery is. You can see Helton Drive.
That's right off of Hill.
I mean, it's just right there. If you didn't know about it, you really wouldn't know it was there. So we only know the names of a handful of people buried there, but that ground is flat enough that we could probably take UNA's GPR and get out there and find a bunch more. But regardless, they had their own cemetery. And it was inventoried about 30 or so years ago by Orland Irons, and that's the late Orland Irons, that's his inventory. And then one other guy was identified as being there, this guy right here, who supposedly is buried there, but I wasn't able to find his obituary either. So as we've noted, the Foundry was operated via a 12-foot overshot water wheel. The Foundry had long had a dam and a mill pond on Cox's Creek, but they had some trouble in everybody being good neighbors. In the late 1850s, they rebuilt the dam 50 feet upstream and 6 inches higher, raising the level of the water in the stream on the property of Lewis Capit Moore and his wife Atlantic Pacific McVeigh Moore. And she was, I can't believe that name, but she was a daughter of former Alabama Governor Hugh McVeigh Moore. They're buried in the McVeigh Moore Cemetery near the Foundry. Well, the stream stayed within its banks, but the level of the water on Lewis Capit Moore's property was raised by 3 inches, and they were upset that their property rights were being violated. On their own land, no less, withdrawing the water from the creek above the dam and returning it to the stream bed further down, keeping water power from the Foundry. So Wright and Rice stopped up Moore's canal. They said, we'll deal with this. Moore and his sons then dug it out again and announced that they, quote, intend to continue to open it as often as it is stopped, unquote. The case went all the way to the Alabama Supreme Court in 1863, several years after the complaint was filed, who finally dismissed the case for want of equity because the defendants, the Moores, have not, according to the statements of the bill, done what we, the court, have above decided that they had a right to do. We decide, therefore, that the bill makes out a proper case for an injunction restraining the defendants, the Moores, from diverting the stream from the complainant's premises. And presumably everybody lived happily ever after that, but I'm not sure. But the Supreme Court stepped in and said they don't really have a case. And here's some more ads from the Foundry from various local newspapers, from the Huntsville Democrat, the American Democrat, Florence's Know Nothing newspaper.
I'm assuming all these corn cob crusher
Yeah, to crush up your corn cobs in your corn for the grain for your animals, I guess. The Memphis Daily Avalanche. Now, in this one, time is money. The Foundry owners, Wright and Rice, say, quote, "To all whom it may concern, we have become tired of wearing ourselves and horses out in trying to collect bills that should have been paid when the work was delivered. Therefore, we've given to Messrs. Sidney Cherry and John C. Posey all our claims to collect, which must be paid to them at once, as we have made them promises to show no quarter." So they're getting desperate and they want their money. So how many people paid their bills, I don't know. But the next reference we have to the Foundry is from October of 1858, where they placed at the Decatur Fair. The Foundry took the premium in 3 cases, winning an award for best specimen castings, an award for the best stock kettle, and an award for improved horsepower. And there's another report of the Decatur Fair showing specifically what they won for. And this is a scalding pot used for scalding and removing the skins of hogs, supposed to have been made at Wright and Rice. At the time this photo was taken, they used it at Mars Hill to cook chicken stew for picnics and fundraisers. And this may be one of the stock kettles that the firm won the award for in 1858 at the Decatur Fair. Now, I have no idea if this thing even exists anymore, or if it does, where is it? But it may be one of their stock kettles they won an award for. Well, on July 2nd, 1860, Wright and Rice gave a most splendid dinner at the Foundry in honor of the 4th, to which Gazette editor Silas G. Barr had been invited. Quote, "But unfortunately, when we applied for a horse and buggy, we came up like the Irishman's hen, among the missing," unquote. So he was not able to attend, but he did report extensively on it. And the Gazette reported that on this occasion, July 2nd, in honor of the 4th, at the Foundry, the Douglas men, those politicians favoring moderate Democrat Stephen Douglas for president in the 1860 election over Breckinridge, or the other candidate, Bell, made speeches. Douglas, as the moderate Democratic popular sovereignty candidate, which allowed voters to decide the issue of slavery at the ballot box, was viewed by many Southerners as an abolitionist in sheep's clothing. The Honorable Judge Sidney C. Posey spoke first. Posey was a lawyer, former newspaper editor, planter, Methodist pastor, and probate judge, who would, with Judge Henry C. Jones, serve as one of Lauderdale's delegates to the 1861 Secession Convention in Montgomery. And as cooperationists, Posey, Jones, and indeed most of the North Alabama delegates to the Secession Convention were cooperationists. They were opposed to immediate state secession. They thought all the southern states should band together, present their grievances to the federal government, and then wait and see what happens. If the federal government acceded to their demands, great. No secession, no war. They only favored secession as a last resort, and then, in their words, all the slaveholding states together. But of course, our delegates got outvoted by the South Alabama Fire Eaters, led by lawyer William L. Yancey, and Alabama seceded anyway. And if you want a great book that goes into all of the details of this, Chris McElwain's Civil War Alabama is a great book. He's become one of my favorite authors, so I hope we get him back to speak at the round table. Yeah, he's had some COVID close calls and stuff like that. So, well, Alabama seceded anyway. Cooperationists like Posey, Jones, Robert Miller Patton reluctantly but forcefully supported the state in secession. And all 3 of these men lost sons in the war. Henry C. Jones served in the Confederate Provisional Congress 1 year, and S.C. Posey was a state legislator during the war, and he died in 1868. As for Wright and Rice, we know that, according to anecdote, Wright was, quote, zealous in the success of his state and country, meaning he was gung-ho for the Confederate States of America. Now, one of the other speakers, one of the other Douglas men that spoke at the Foundry on July 2nd, 1869, or 1860, was Douglas elector, future Alabama governor, and father of famed local educator Miss Maud Lindsay, Robert Burns Lindsay of Tuscumbia in Franklin County, whom Editor Barr, a supporter of the conservative secessionist Democratic candidate Breckinridge, called out in the Florence Gazette because in his speech he claimed that R.B. Lindsay had, contrary to Douglas's actual platform, Lindsay was claiming that Douglas was actually a protector of slavery rather than a squatter sovereignty candidate. So the Gazette editor called him out for really misrepresenting Douglas as wanting to preserve slavery. And I haven't found a response from Lindsay yet, so I don't know if Lindsay wrote back and said, hey, wait a minute, you took me out of context or I never said that. But I thought it was interesting they got into a bit of a political argument over Douglas. Now, somebody was talking about Bowie knives earlier. During the actual war, after the war had actually started, Wright and Rice made a variety of arms and armaments for the Confederate war effort, including Bowie knives. And this is a photo from Richard Sheridan's article of one that was 16 inches in length, made by Wright and Rice in Florence, Alabama. And a breech-loading rifle cannon invented by James Wright in April of 1861 is particularly fascinating. A breech-loading cannon had rifling in the barrel and was loaded from the breech at the rear end of the gun, giving it directional stability and an increased range. According to the Florence Gazette, James Wright actually received a patent for this gun, which the Gazette editor Silas Barr thought should be called Wright's breech loader and exhibited in Montgomery. The Gazette also noted, and here's another article from the Florence Gazette, which they've, I think, reprinted from somewhere else and corrected. So it apparently made a bit of news, this breech loader that Wright invented. But the Gazette noted that Wright had already cast a prototype breech-loading cannon for Florence, which was to be mounted on a carriage as soon as adequate timber could be procured. So I don't know if they actually ever did mount this cannon and if it was actually ever fired or not. So I'd love to know that, which is another reason I was hoping Greg and David would be here, but they let me down. Well, Wright was scheduled to exhibit his breech loader at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia. I'm not sure that he did, but he was supposed to. And that's a picture of the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia. And again, several national papers picked this up across the South. This is from Charleston, quoting the Mobile Advertiser.
Yeah, there were hardly any breech loaders out early in the war.
Yeah. Well, apparently, this is a photo, a vintage photo, and one that exists today. Either it's a vintage one that still exists, or it may be a recreation of an 1857 model 12-pound Whitworth breech-loading rifle cannon that was used at Antietam. And apparently, this is what a breech-loading rifle cannon looked like. And Wright and Rice's would have been similar to this.
Yeah.
I don't actually have any.
That's that in England, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any. Yeah, I believe it was.
Where was that top photo from?
From Antietam. It says Antietam in the caption. I don't know if it's before or after, presumably after. Well, then we have to skip up to 1861 because actual records on the Foundry during the war are very scarce. So in late August of 1861, Reverend Dr. Felix Johnson, one of the original partners, or one of the partners, earlier partners in the Foundry, invented a Colt-type repeating rifle. And Johnson had been appointed by the Governor and Military Board of Tennessee to contract with Wright and Rice to manufacture these weapons, but I can't find any documentation as to whether they ever produced any or not. So, John, you ever heard?
Haven't heard anything.
I haven't heard whether they actually made any or not.
I didn't know they made that cannon. Lloyd Jackson, a big collector.
Yeah, have you ever seen any of those? That I forgot. Lloyd's a big knife and gun collector.
What year was that?
This is 1861.
That was awful early. That was like a week after
Yeah.
when he got that patent for the cannon.
So I have no idea. if any of this stuff was made.
Well, if it was made to any quantity, they know about it, right?
I think probably so. At any rate, by November 4th, 1861, Dr. John B. Reed was a Tuscaloosa physician, pharmacist, and surgeon for the University of Alabama's Corps of Cadets, who was also an inventor. In 1856, Reed had obtained a patent for a shell, which he called Reed's shell, that allowed cannon barrels to be rifled, thereby significantly increasing their range and accuracy. The so-called Reed shell was used by the Federals in their Parrott rifles, the most common artillery weapon of the war, and by the Confederates in their advanced Brooke rifles. So here is a diagram of Reed, which I didn't know about Reed shells until I did this research. Yeah, you guys are all way more up on this than I am, and here's some actual photos of various calibers of Reed shells. Now, in November of 1861, Reed had a conditional contract with Wright and Rice to manufacture his Reed shells for between $3.40 or $4 apiece. However, as Wright and Rice explained by letter to Brigadier General J.M. Wither, Confederate States at Mobile, the firm ultimately declined the contract on the grounds that the firm couldn't make them at these prices. And that's the letter from Wright and Rice to General Withers declining the contract, that they couldn't make them for Reed's prices. And this article is just fun for lots of different reasons. One day in late November or early December, Gazette editor Silas Barr decided to ride out to the Foundry, as he was wont to do. Reporting on his visit in the Gazette of Wednesday, December 4th, editor Barr said in part, quote, "On arriving at the place, we're surprised to see so many new improvements on the ground since our last visit. On entering the first new building, we were saluted by some of our acquaintances who were very busily engaged in filling up small boxes with sand. We, of course, were anxious to know what these men could be playing at we, of course, were anxious to know what these men could be at playing in the dirt. After scanning their movements for a time and not being able to divine their object, we ventured to ask what they were at, and were very politely informed that they were preparing to make pills. Upon asking the use of these pills, we were told, quote, that they were to give to the Yankees, unquote. They are administered to the Yankees in a very peculiar way, similar, we suppose, to the way they were given to them at Manassas, Columbus, Fort Sumter, and other places where our men have thrashed the insolent invader. From this department, we passed into another building, Mr. Wright, who kindly volunteered his services to show us around. Among other things, he showed us some of the above-mentioned pills that they had already manufactured, they having an order from our government for a quantity, which, if they ever come in contact with the Yankee carcass, will hasten his frightened ghost over Jordan. In our walk, we came upon 3 small guns which we judged would carry an 8, 10, or 12-pound ball. On pausing from these smaller instruments of death, we came upon one, a trifle large, very comfortably lying upon its proppings, in which we would weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. It was the largest one we ever saw except one, and carried a shell weighing 44 pounds. It was 4 or 4.5 feet long, and had an enormous hole in it, and no doubt will make the Yankees headache if ever it should be brought into position before them," unquote. So that was, hasten his frightened ghost across the Jordan if they come in contact with one of these pills. So that describes by December 4th, 1861, some of what was going on at the Foundry. Well, in December of 1861, the Alabama General Assembly exempted from military duty all persons employed by Horace Ware Manufacturing Arms and Armaments, and this act was later extended to include the employees of Wright and Rice, and all similar manufacturers enjoy the same privileges. So if you worked at one of these foundries or machine shops, you were exempted from military duty. By January of 1862, a Soldiers' Aid Society had been established in Lauderdale County, which since its formation had, quote, cut and made 3,600 articles of clothing independent of the donation sent to Virginia and Missouri, unquote. Not to be left out, in January of 1862, the ladies at the Foundry contributed 2 overcoats. On February 2nd, 1863, Confederate Quartermaster W.D. Thomason purchased 4 skillets and 2 ovens for $14.40 from the Foundry, which he received at Tuscumbia. On April 3rd, 1863, Alabama Confederate Quartermaster Major George W. Jones purchased 8 rolls of leather for $1,173 from Wright and Rice. These must have been really massive rolls of leather to be that much money. And these are the last 2 wartime references to the Foundry that I can find. In her diary of May 12, 1863, the young Sally Independence Foster, who lived in Courtview Mansion at the head of Court Street in Florence, which we know as Rogers Hall, noted in her diary that, quote, Miss Maggie Irvin, Sister Jenny, and I rode out to the Foundry and back on horseback, unquote. And this was just a few weeks before Union Colonel Florence M. Cornyn's raid through Florence in northwest Alabama. According to his orders from General Grenville Dodge, Colonel Cornyn of the 10th Missouri Cavalry, United States, was instructed that, quote, if any of your command reach as far east as Florence, the cotton and woolen mills and foundries north of that place will be destroyed, unquote. Presumably, these orders included the Wright and Rice foundry and machine shop. However, in his June 2, 1863 report to General Dodge, Cornyn reported destroying 7 cotton factories in the area, but doesn't refer to destroying the Wright and Rice foundry or machine shop. So was the foundry totally destroyed, or was just the machinery for making armaments dismantled? Not sure. But if the Florence Herald's August 11, 1892 reminiscence article was correct, it would indicate that Wright and Rice were making armaments up through March or April of 1865, at which time Union General James H. Wilson's raid into northwest Alabama began. Because in that article they say that one contract of the foundries called for 300 tons shot in canister, which was not completed on account of General Wilson's raid through this section. So that makes, this could be total anecdote. They could not be remembering this correctly, or it may be correct, which is one reason I wanted Greg and David to be here so I could see if that makes any sense to them. What about it, Lanny? Does that make any sense to you that the foundry could have still been in operation through early 1865 when Wilson came through?
Wilson came down here from Nashville and started setting up camp at Bradley Springs in January 1865.
Because this article says that they couldn't complete their order because of Wilson, his raid through this section. So I don't know anyway. I don't know. All I can say with any certainty is by September of 1865, it appears that Wright and Rice was not destroyed, or at least not totally, as the firm was advertising in the Tuscumbia, North Alabamian of September 1865, that they were in, quote, full operation. However, they wouldn't stay in business very long, just another about 2.5 years, declaring bankruptcy in December of 1868. So their notice in the Florence Journal, noting their property for sale, noted the following property in real estate, quote, a foundry and machine shop with about 490 acres of land attached on which is a good water power, a machine shop 120 feet long by 40 feet wide, 2.5 stories high, a line of polished shafting 120 feet long, driven by a 12-foot overshot water wheel, also a foundry building containing 2 cupolas, a fan, 120 feet of shafting, ladles, cranes, and chains, flasks, and all the tools necessary for a good casting business. Also, the finest stock of patterns in the South, being the accumulation of 30 years and costing some $200,000. Steam saw and grist mill, 8-inch cylinder engine, 24 feet boiler, 40 inches in diameter, sawmill with 24 feet carriage and 50-inch saw, 12 good dwelling houses, some 30 tons of all kinds of cast iron assorted, 4 or 5,000 rounds of wrought iron, or 4 or 5,000 pounds of wrought iron, 1 new iron lathe, 1 large lathe partly finished, 1 12-inch engine partly finished, 2 good mules and wagon, about 20,000 brick, 3 good farms, 94.5 acres of good farmland, well timbered, situated on the Military Road and Waynesboro Road, 4 miles north of Florence, called the Kentucky Place, 100 acres of land containing a good mill site and water power on Second Creek, called the Bray Place. So I don't exactly know what caused them to go bankrupt, but they did, and so they advertised their property for sale, and former Florence Merchant, state legislator and Alabama governor. He was governor from 1865 to 1867, at which time he was replaced by Reconstruction Governor Robert Miller Patton, bought the old Foundry property. So that got picked up, interestingly enough, by the Greensboro, Alabama Beacon, that Governor Patton had bought the iron foundry near Florence in this state.
Excuse me, based on those couple of dates there in 1868 or whenever, that's probably true that when General James H. Wilson's troops started marching down through here, it's true today, that's a lot, it probably was true, you know.
Yeah, I think maybe that they may have been in operation up to 1864 or early 1865, and then when Wilson came through, they were afraid to, or they couldn't fulfill their order for some reason. I need to do a little bit more research and maybe talk to Greg about this. But in December of 1869, Governor Patton advertised his 2,500 acres of land, including most of what is now East Florence, as well as the old Foundry lands, as being for sale, as he intended to move to South Alabama to attend to railroad concerns. He was into railroads at that time. However, apparently Patton never made this move. He's enumerated in the 1870 census at Sweetwater in Lauderdale County. And apparently he maintained control of the foundry at least until Elder Theophilus Brown, T.B. Larimore of Mars Hill Academy purchased the old foundry property in 1876. T.B. Larimore came here. He was originally from Jefferson County, Tennessee, grew up in Sequatchie County, served through the war in the Confederate military, then came here in 1868 briefly, taught at Mountain Home Academy in 1868 over in Lawrence County, and then eventually came back to Lauderdale County and married Julia Esther Gresham. If you'll remember, her father, Freeman Gresham, sold W.P. Johnson the original property to build the foundry. Well, sort of comes full circle. Elder T.B. Larimore buys the property back from Governor Patton. As this article from the Lauderdale Times of March 12, 1872 notes, ex-Governor Patton routinely allowed Larimore to use the upstairs floor of the old foundry building for Mars Hill's commencement exercises when the crowds were too big for the school's academy building. Patton also was a benefactor of the academy, on several occasions making speeches and presenting gold medals to exemplary students. And you can see here it says that we are permitted by Patton to say that the exercises will take place in the second story of the foundry near the academy. And so here's again that artist drawing of the foundry with Larimore's report of the closing exercises, or the Lauderdale Times' report of the closing exercises, which they said on account of its size, the upstairs room of the foundry was used for the occasion, Governor Patton having kindly given his consent. Evergreen decorations, the auditory, attentive, and polite pupils, and the scholarly principal seemed to transform the room from a machine shop to a classic hall. And again, local researcher, the late Hiawatha Walker, said that the old Wright and Rice Foundry was actually located where the Mars Hill Church of Christ is now. So it's a little bit closer to the Larimore house than it probably was in real life in that drawing. Again, in 1876, Larimore decided to buy the old foundry, which became the first meeting house of the Mars Hill Church of Christ before the 1904 building was constructed. But actually, it's Miss Julia Esther Gresham, Larimore's first wife, whose name is on the deed, because Larimore was penniless when he got to Florence. And For most of his business and real estate transactions, his wife or brother-in-law, John Andrew Thompson, acted on his behalf in his legal and property transactions. So Julia Esther, her name is actually on the deed to the patent property that they bought. So Mars Hill Academy, later Mars Hill College, closed in 1887 in order for Elder Larimore to preach full-time. He was in such high demand, he felt like God was calling him back into the ministry full-time. And by 1914, the Mars Hill home and farm were up for lease. I don't know who bought the property from Larimore, only that by May of 1879, Isaac Price operated a blacksmith shop at the old foundry, which shop was destroyed by fire on Thursday night, May 15th of 1879. And Mr. Price was a native of Giles County, Tennessee, who for about 25 years lived and worked at South Florence in Franklin, then in Colbert County, and he died Monday, February 9th at the home of his son, Charles Price of Florence. So that is all that I have been able to figure out about the Wright and Rice Foundry and Machine Shop to date. Again, it's a work in progress. So if anybody's got any quick questions,